We are living in the shadow of a great unraveling. For 60 long years, a colonial machine wrapped in the language of partnership drained the heart of Africa, feeding Europe's reactors, its banks, and its comforts. Gold from Burkina Faso, uranium from Niger, soldiers' blood from Mali, all extracted under the banner of stability, all disguised as friendship, while our nations sank deeper into poverty. And yet, in our lifetime, that machine has begun to shudder, to break, to collapse before our very eyes. Look to the Sahel. Look to the land where young men with unyielding vision now stand tall against giants. Just 3 years ago, Emmanuel Macron spoke in Ouagadougou, promising France would always remain the trusted partner of the region. Today, those promises lie in ruins. French troops are leaving. NATO's bases, once symbols of untouchable dominance, now sit abandoned, handed back to sovereign African hands. But let us be clear, this is not simply a military withdrawal. This is the fall of an empire that had chained itself to Africa's future. It is the exposure of a truth the West never wanted the world to see, that Africa's children are no longer willing to accept crumbs while their wealth feeds foreign nations. The tide has turned. The Sahel Revolution is not an episode, not a passing storm. It is a beginning. And yet, a question hangs heavy in the air. How is it that NATO, the most powerful alliance in history armed with unmatched firepower and global networks, now stands paralyzed? Why are they watching quietly as the empire they built for decades crumbles in silence? 3 years ago, the cameras shone on a confident Emmanuel Macron as he stood in Ouagadougou. His voice carried the arrogance of a power certain of its permanence. He promised that France's hand would never let go of the Sahel, that the partnership would endure, that the bond was unbreakable. But family, look around today. The very soil he stood upon now tells a different story. The convoys are moving out. The tricolor flags that once fluttered above foreign barracks now come down in silence. French troops pack their bags in Mali, in Burkina Faso, in Niger. Bases that once served as launch pads for interventions dressed up as security, but hiding the hunger for resources, are now returned to African control. What the world is witnessing is not simply a redeployment. No, it is the collapse of an imperial order built on deception and exploitation. For decades, Paris claimed that its military presence was the price of protection. They said, "With us, you're safe." Yet safety never came. Terrorist attacks multiplied, villages burned, and instability grew even as foreign boots stamped the earth. Meanwhile, behind closed doors, contracts were signed that handed over Africa's lifeblood. Gold from Burkina Faso was dug out and shipped away, enriching European treasuries while our children remained barefoot. Uranium from Niger kept French lights glowing at night, even as Nigerians themselves lived in darkness. Mali's resources fed markets abroad while its people remained trapped in poverty. This was the bargain of the CFA franc, of military pacts, of endless summits, 6 decades of one-sided partnership, 6 decades of broken promises. France, through its empire in disguise, drained an estimated $500 billion from its former colonies. And what did the people receive in return? Poverty, debt, dependency. Then came a new generation of leaders, bold enough to ask the forbidden question: if this system is so beneficial, why are we still among the poorest nations on earth? In Burkina Faso, Captain Ibrahim Traoré did not merely seize political power, he began to rewrite the economic destiny of his country. Mining contracts once tilted toward Europe were torn open, renegotiated, redirected for the benefit of Burkina Faso people. The same winds blew through Niger. Uranium, long taken for granted by French companies, was suddenly subject to national review. "No more," said the voices of sovereignty. Mali turned its gaze eastward, choosing partnerships with Russia and China that promised technology transfer, infrastructure, and real development, not endless extraction. These were not rash or emotional decisions. They were deliberate, strategic, crafted by leaders who understood the essence of sovereignty, that without economic independence, political freedom is nothing more than a performance. And so, one by one, the pillars of France's neo-colonial empire crumbled. But the story does not end here, because even as the contracts changed and the troops withdrew, something far more powerful was awakening. A shift not of soldiers, not of governments alone, but of millions of young hearts beating with a new conviction. The world's youngest population, the Sahel's 70% under 30, stood up and asked their own questions. Has French presence brought prosperity? No. Has NATO's protection delivered stability? No. Has Western partnership opened the path to dignity? No. Their answers were clear. Their patience ended. This was no longer just about governments negotiating deals. It was about entire peoples reclaiming their futures. And so, the old empire, still rich in weapons, still dominant in finance, suddenly found itself paralyzed. Because how do you fight not just a handful of soldiers, not just a coup, but an entire generation that refuses to be silent? The young leaders of the Sahel had pulled the first stone from the wall, and the cracks began to spread. The question is no longer whether the wall will fall, but how far and how fast. But family, understand this. What frightens NATO's generals is not only the loss of mines and bases. It is the fire in the eyes of Africa's youth. And that fire cannot be bombed, cannot be silenced, cannot be bought. So what will NATO do when the future itself turns against them? Family, let us pause and see the heart of this storm. The Sahel is not merely a land of shifting contracts and retreating armies. It is the youngest region on Earth. More than 70% of its people are under the age of 30. Think about that for a moment. A generation unchained, unafraid, unbought. A generation that has lived its entire life under the shadow of Western partnership and seen only hunger, chaos, and betrayal. These are not children who can be tricked by slogans of democracy while their wells run dry. These are not youths who will cheer for NATO's speeches while their resources are carted away. They have watched Iraq. They have watched Afghanistan. They have seen Libya burn. They have seen, with their own eyes, what Western intervention brings. Not order, but ashes. Not stability, but collapse. And so, when a young leader like Ibrahim Traoré speaks with clarity about sovereignty, about dignity, about Africa's right to control its wealth, they listen. They believe. They follow. Because unlike the hollow promises of foreign presidents, his words echo their lived reality. For NATO strategists, this is a nightmare. In the past, interventions relied on popular uprisings against leaders, or at least indifference from the people. In the Sahel today, an intervention would not be a war against a government. It would be a war against an entire people. Villagers, students, workers, all standing shoulder to shoulder, not with foreign flags, but with their own. And the military equation grows darker still. NATO commands unmatched firepower, jets that can level cities, satellites that see every movement, systems that can strike across continents. But what justification do they have here? These nations are not threatening Western soil. They are not invading anyone. They are not seeking conquest. They are simply saying, our gold is ours. Our uranium is ours. Our destiny is ours. Tell me, family, how does an empire justify bombing a people for choosing their own partners? How does NATO explain to its citizens that young Africans must die because they prefer Russian cooperation over French control or Chinese infrastructure over World Bank conditions? The moral cover that once shielded intervention has evaporated, and Western citizens, scarred by the costs of endless wars, are no longer willing to march blindly into another desert of blood. Meanwhile, on the ground, the Sahel Alliance shows remarkable strategy. They learned from Gaddafi's fall, from the betrayals of past leaders. They refuse to stand alone. They forge regional bonds, strengthening each other so that no one can be picked off in isolation. They diversify their alliances, Russia for defense, China for roads and dams, new trade partners for resilience. Every step reduces Western leverage. Every agreement weakens NATO's grip. And listen closely. The people themselves are the shield. French bases, once supplied by local labor, now find themselves isolated. Intelligence networks built on African informants crumble when those informants switch sides. Overflight rights vanish. Supply routes close. The most powerful alliance in history finds its hands tied by the will of ordinary men and women who simply refuse to comply. The reaction outside Africa is no less telling. In Algeria, memories of anti-colonial struggles stir solidarity. In Nigeria, the people pressure their leaders to stand with their Sahelian brothers. Even governments once firmly tied to the West are hesitating, calculating, asking whether siding with NATO's agenda would mean betraying their own youth. And across the continent, Africa's young voices rise. From Morocco to Madagascar, from Lagos to Addis Ababa, they look to the Sahel and see a mirror. They see courage. They see possibility. They ask themselves, if they can resist, why can't we? This, beloved family, is the true explosion shaking the world. Not just the retreat of soldiers, not just the fall of contracts, but the birth of a generation that believes in Africa's sovereignty as a living, breathing reality. And that is why NATO, despite its missiles and its billions, sits paralyzed. Because how can you fight the tide of history? How can you bomb the future out of a people who refuse to bow? And so the West watches, its media confused, its generals restless. But behind closed doors, fear grows. For they know this is no temporary storm. This is a new season. The question now is, what will be the cost of trying to turn back the clock? Family, every revolution births consequences, and the Sahel Revolution is no exception. What we see today is more than the retreat of an army. It is the unraveling of narratives, the collapse of illusions, the shaking of an empire at its very core. Look first at the media. Western outlets, long used to framing Africa as a place of chaos and coups, suddenly find themselves tongue-tied. They do not know how to describe a young captain like Ibrahim Traoré, who enjoys genuine popularity, who renegotiates contracts in favor of his people, who speaks of dignity not as a slogan, but as a policy. He is neither the Western-friendly Democrat they wish to praise, nor the brutal dictator they are ready to condemn. And so, the headlines stumble, the commentaries falter, the analysts contradict one another. Confusion is the new language of the Western press. Then look at the parliaments of Europe and America. Legislators ask, how do we explain this to our citizens? After the failures of Iraq, Afghanistan, and Libya, how do they justify another foreign intervention, this time not to fight terrorists, but to restore mining contracts? Their voters are weary, their treasuries drained. Western economies reel from inflation, from the heavy costs of supporting Ukraine, from debts mounting like storm clouds. Who among them will stand before their people and argue that Africa's children must suffer so that foreign lights may stay on? And here lies a deeper truth. Africa's awakening does not stop at the Sahel. From Algeria to Ethiopia, from South Africa to Nigeria, leaders are reassessing, populations are demanding, and the winds of sovereignty blow stronger each day. Even governments that once bent easily to Paris and Washington now hesitate, sensing that the tide of history is turning. They know that to side against the Sahel is to side against their own people, against the very youth who hold the future in their hands. This is why the consequences ripple far beyond military strategy. The old system, the CFA franc, the resource contracts, the military pacts, was not just an arrangement of states. It was the spine of a world order that kept Africa bent low. But with each renegotiated deal, with each base abandoned, that spine fractures. The collapse of one empire becomes the tremor that shakes many others. Family, think on this. NATO's paralysis is not only military, it is moral. For decades, the West cloaked its actions in the garments of human rights and democracy. But what moral ground remains when the people themselves rise up in support of their leaders? What legitimacy is left when governments deliver security and development where foreign troops failed? Intervention would not restore order. It would restore the very dependency that Africans have rejected. And so, in the streets of Bamako, Niamey, Ouagadougou, you find a new rhythm. Flags raised high, voices chanting for sovereignty, not in fear, but in pride. Children march with their parents. Elders bless the movement. It is no longer just politics. It is culture. It is spirit. It is identity reclaimed. Yet make no mistake, this awakening carries risks. The West is not ready to surrender quietly. Pressure will mount. Economic sanctions, covert operations, propaganda wars. Every tool of empire will be deployed to slow this momentum. But unlike before, the Sahel does not stand alone. Russia and China offer partnerships. Algeria and Nigeria provide regional cover, and across Africa, millions stand ready to echo the cry, Africa's wealth for Africa's children. Herein lies the ultimate consequence. NATO and its allies face not a temporary setback, but the possibility of continental isolation. To strike against the Sahel Alliance now risks igniting a fire across Africa that no foreign power can contain. So the empire trembles, unsure of its next move. Will it dare to strike, knowing the backlash could engulf a continent? Or will it step back, forced at last to face a new reality? Family, the answer lies not only in Brussels or Washington, it lies in the hearts of Africa's people. And that is a battlefield NATO can never win. Family, let us now lift our eyes beyond the Sahel and see how the world responds. For this revolution does not happen in silence. It echoes across oceans. It rattles the halls of power in Washington, in Brussels, in Paris. In the United States, the shadow of Iraq and Afghanistan still lingers. Soldiers came home scarred, coffins returned draped in flags, and trillions of dollars were spent with nothing to show but broken nations and bitter memories. The American people are weary, exhausted from wars that promised freedom but delivered chaos. Tell me, who among them will march for another intervention in Africa to restore mining rights to French companies? The White House knows the truth. Any attempt to rally public support for new wars in Africa would be met with anger, not applause. And in Europe, the situation is no better. Inflation gnaws at households, energy costs rise, and budgets are already stretched thin by the war in Ukraine. The coffers of NATO's allies bleed. Their people protest in the streets, and their unity frays with every passing season. To open another front in Africa is not just unpopular, it is impossible. Meanwhile, in Africa itself, the mood has shifted. The African Union, once cautious, now feels the pressure of its own citizens. Leaders who might have once nodded quietly to Western requests now hesitate. They understand that to side against the Sahel is to risk their own legitimacy. Algeria, with its proud anti-colonial past, stands firm for sovereignty. Nigeria faces its own youth, demanding solidarity with their brothers and sisters across the Sahel. Even Egypt, long aligned with Western powers, knows the price of betraying a continental awakening. And then come Russia and China, standing at the edges of this drama but shaping its course nonetheless. Russia offers weapons and training. China builds roads and power plants. Neither moves out of pure generosity, but both provide alternatives. Alternatives that break Western monopoly. Alternatives that make NATO's threats weaker with every handshake, every signed agreement. So here's the paradox facing the world's most powerful alliance. Overwhelming weapons, yet no will to use them. Vast resources, yet no justification for intervention. Political ambition, yet no public support. NATO finds itself trapped, not by its enemies, but by the very reality of a changing world. And family, this is the essence of the shift. The empire is no longer feared. Its words ring hollow, its threats sound weak, its presence is no longer welcomed. Across Africa and beyond, nations watch the Sahel and ask themselves, if they can break free, why not us? The stage is set, the actors revealed, the world holding its breath. But the question remains, where does Africa go from here? What path lies ahead for a continent awakening from centuries of chains? Family, every revolution raises a final pressing question. What comes next? The Sahel Alliance has broken chains, reclaimed dignity, and forced the empire to retreat. But history teaches us that liberation is not a single moment. It is a path, long and uncertain, filled with trials. Ahead lies three possible roads. The first, and the brightest, is the path of strength and unity. If Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger can hold together, if they can build on shared sovereignty and defend one another, then they become more than a movement. They become a model. A beacon for Africa's future. In this vision, Africa's wealth fuels Africa's children, not foreign treasuries. Roads are paved, schools are built, and young people see opportunity where once there was only despair. This is the dream that fuels the chants in the streets today. But there is also the second path, the darker one. The empire does not rest easily. Sanctions may tighten, covert operations may multiply, whispers of division may be planted among allies. The machinery of destabilization tested in Libya and elsewhere may yet be turned upon the Sahel. If leaders falter, if unity cracks, if corruption reemerges, the revolution could stumble. The West would seize on any weakness, declaring triumph as Africa falls back into dependency. And then there is a third road, a continent transformed into a true multipolar power. In this vision, the Sahel is only the beginning. From Dakar to Addis Ababa, from Cairo to Cape Town, nations rise to demand fair partnerships, not subjugation. No longer dependent on NATO's goodwill, no longer tied to Europe's chains, Africa stands as a force in its own right, sovereign, dignified, unbreakable. Which road will Africa walk? That is not a question for generals in Brussels, nor presidents in Washington. It is a question for Africa's people, for the farmers and miners, for the students and mothers, for the youth who refuse to bow. Because family, the most powerful truth revealed in this moment is that the empire can no longer dictate Africa's future. The silence of NATO, the confusion of Western media, the retreat of foreign troops, all of it proves one thing. The future now rests where it always should have been, in African hands. But as Africa stands on the edge of a new dawn, one question burns brighter than all. Is this the beginning of NATO's end in Africa, or merely the opening battle in a struggle that will define the century? Family, what we have witnessed is not a fleeting headline or a passing crisis. It is the crumbling of an empire and the rising of a continent. For 60 years, Africa's lifeblood was siphoned away, its people told to wait, to be patient, to trust in partnerships that never delivered. But now the tide has turned. The Sahel has lit a fire, and that fire cannot be put out. We see it in the eyes of the young, in the determination of leaders like Ibrahim Traoré, in the chants that echo from Bamako to Ouagadougou. This is more than politics. This is dignity reclaimed. This is sovereignty reborn. And it speaks not only to the Sahel, but to the whole of Africa's awakening. NATO's generals may sit in their war rooms, drawing maps, counting weapons, whispering of strategies. But all their power means nothing when faced with a people who refuse to bow. NATO's silence, its paralysis, is the loudest admission of all. The old world is dying, and a new one is being born. Africa's path forward will not be easy. There will be pressure, sabotage, betrayal. But there will also be courage, solidarity, and vision. And every step forward proves a deeper truth, that Africa's destiny belongs to no empire. It belongs to Africa itself. So I ask you, family, how far will this movement spread? Will it remain in the Sahel, or will it sweep across the continent, reshaping the balance of power for generations to come? And tell me, how long can the West ignore the voice of Africa's youth rising in unison? If you believe in this awakening, if you believe Africa's future must be written by African hands, then let your voice be heard. Hit that subscribe button, share this message, and leave your thoughts below. Because every like, every comment, every share is part of this struggle for dignity and sovereignty. Together, we are not just watching history, we are shaping it. And one day, when the world asks how Africa broke free, we will say it began here, with voices that refuse to be silenced.